that he was unresponsive, Mr. Floyd, for almost 3 full minutes of about a third of the time that he was under the knee. His neck was under the knee of the officer. Presumably, the officer would notice that he was unresponsive, which is baffling.
It is totally baffling. We don't understand why that would be. I mean, he would have noticed it. There were people around that would have clearly noticed it. I mean, that was just obviously blatantly disregarding what you were seeing right in front of you. So that's I don't even have to say it's baffling. It seems really concerning that would happen and that no one else flagged it. I think I could hear that people were saying things, but I don't know if he wasn't listening or what. But it was clear that he was unresponsive. Somebody who's right there would have absolutely noticed that.
And Reddit, the charging document also says that the officers tried to get Floyd into the squad car multiple times, but he, quote, struggled with officers by intentionally falling down, saying he was not going in the car and refusing to stand still, unquote. Would that be considered resisting arrest by police standards? Why would this be included in the charging document?
You could articulate that that's resisting arrest, but you can never equate what you saw the victim do on camera to what the response was from the officers that ultimately took his life. There were multiple opportunities, it appeared to me, once he was under the control of all 4 officers, for them to just pick him up and put him in the car. He was expressing his willingness to stand. He was asking to stand. So I think that is really a non-issue, and it doesn't mitigate anything when it comes to prosecuting this case. What I am encouraged by, though, what I see around the country, and we've had this conversation now running for years, Jake, is more and more law enforcement officers speaking out against this obvious abuse of power. From Los Angeles to New York, we've seen chiefs of police and other officers and people in the criminal justice system condemning the vicious act that they saw on this camera, and we need to see more of that. I've always believed that the change that we need to see in this system, beyond the change that we need to see throughout the nation relative to race and racism and institutional racism, is that people inside the system and who have proximity have the opportunity to change the system from inside. We're starting to see more of that, and it's very important relative to bringing cases like this, who your DA is, who your circuit attorneys are. Here in St. Louis, for example, we have a circuit attorney, Kim Gardner, who has been aggressive in going after police who abuse their authority. We need to see more of that, and they need to be supported when they do it because, of course, they come under attack from keepers of the status quo and law enforcement unions that never want to be held accountable for anything, including incidents like this.
It's a good point. I have noticed other police chiefs condemning this in a way that I haven't in previous such incidents. And we should remind our viewers that what Mr. Floyd was accused of having done is having used a counterfeit $20 bill. This wasn't a violent crime he was being accused of or asked about. Laura, let me ask you, the Hennepin County attorney in Minnesota says that he anticipates charges against the other officers involved, but his office wanted to get the, quote, most dangerous perpetrator first. As you know, there's new video showing what other officers were doing when George Floyd was being held on the ground. What kind of charges might they face?
Well, oftentimes if people are acting in concert with somebody, they will be held to the same standard and liable for the actions that that person has taken. So, for example, in a concept generally of felony murder, if you have decided to engage in an armed robbery and one of you ends up killing someone, well, guess what? Everyone who planned that armed robbery is now liable for what's happened. A similar theme could be had with these other officers if you're talking about what role they played, either passive or active. That's also, however, why they were calling for more witnesses to come forward, in addition to this video, to say, what else have people seen? Is there more indication that this was an active participant or a passive person who simply was complicit by turning a blind eye? We'll have to wait and see.
All right, Laura, thanks so much. And thanks so much to Van and Reddit and Sanjay, of course. Coming up, President Trump announces a press conference, but does not hold a press conference. He takes no questions and completely ignores the situation in Minnesota, to say nothing of the 100,000 plus dead from coronavirus. We're also watching crowded protests building across the nation already this afternoon after one officer has been charged in the murder of George Floyd. Stay with us.
Well, Minnesotans, your pain is real. The chapter that's been written this week is one of our darkest chapters.
Welcome back to our national lead. That was Minnesota Governor Tim Walz pleading for help to restore order, stop protests turning into lawlessness, and to put an end to those who, quote, dropped firebombs into businesses. Now the Minneapolis mayor is imposing a curfew tonight beginning at 8 p.m. Joining us now, Minneapolis City Council member Alondra Cano. Councilwoman Cano, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with the investigation. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has now been charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. What's your reaction to that? And do you want charges against the other three officers?
I do want charges against the other three officers. I think all four people were involved and implicit in the cold, calculated, cruel killing of Mr. George Floyd. I am very pleased to hear of the arrest by the BCA, and I have made a request to the governor's office to transfer the case from the jurisdictional purview of our Hennepin County District Attorney Mike Freeman to the hands of our Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison.
And we've just seen 3 nights of protests in Minneapolis. Some of the protests, of course, turned violent. The city's 3rd police precinct was on fire last night. Officers have been responding using rubber bullets and tear gas and more. What's your message to the protesters?
I know that many of our protesters that have been out there trying to protect the sanctity of life through their voice and their actions are peaceful. Many of them indeed have participated in the actions and gotten hurt by our Minneapolis Police Department. And that does not sit well with me. And there will be, I would say, actions that the council will consider in the coming days and weeks to make sure that we are able to correct for those behaviors and those actions, because we did not want to see anybody tear gassed. We did not want to see anybody hit with rubber bullets. We have multiple reports from the ground where folks were indeed acting peacefully, but would get hurt nonetheless. That's different than the folks who I think are out there putting buildings into fire and threatening the life of renters who are sleeping in the middle of the night while their buildings are burning right underneath them. It's different than the people who are continuing to go back to the businesses day after day to rob them of their property and their goods. And my main concern really is for the small and immigrant locally owned businesses that we have been working so hard to elevate, to close the city's racial wealth gaps. And so I think for us, many of us who are working on these issues of police reform and police transformation, we are unified in that we want peaceful demonstrations and we want a peaceful show of a voice for accountability. And we do not support the burning down of buildings. Right now, Lake Street is in shambles. There could be irreversible damage done to our communities that will take years and years and years to bring back. So I do hope people take it to heart that it's time to turn the page. We've seen the grief come out of our community on Monday night, on Tuesday night. We have seen the physical impact of that grief on the structures around us. And now I invite all of the folks who want to see true accountability to turn the page and focus on the difficult and long work that we have ahead of us to deconstruct the policing systems that we have inherited and to rebuild from the ground up systems that are going to align with our values and with protecting the safety of all human beings.
All right. Councilwoman Alondra Cano, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And we're praying for peace in Minnesota. There have been days of protests, now one arrest, but protests are already building this afternoon across the nation. So will tensions remain high tonight? Stay with us. Right now, demonstrations are happening across the United States in response to the killing of George Floyd while in police custody in Minnesota, including in New York City, where several protesters have already been arrested and multiple police officers have been injured, according to NYPD. Crowds are also growing in Minneapolis, the site of Floyd's murder, where fiery protests erupted last night. Laura Coates, Van Jones, Reddit Hudson are back with me now. And Reddit, now that there's an official curfew for the city of Minneapolis, what might happen tonight? Legally, people cannot go outside to protest, but I don't know how much that's going to stop people who are understandably very upset.
I don't know that it's going to stop them either. I think it helps that an officer was charged at least. But I was there several years ago when Philando Castile was murdered. I remember sitting in the living room with his mother, with some other folks who were there to talk about steps going forward and how she was discouraged about the history of policing in that community and the lack of accountability behind abuses like what had happened with her son. And I think that this community is so deeply wounded, as we are all over the nation, with repeated instances of officers murdering Black bodies, unarmed people with no accountability. And the expectation is that initially we may see people going through the motions, we may see charges, but until you see a conviction and some prison time for an animal like Derek Chauvin, I don't know that the crowds are going to be calmed. I don't know that they're going to be peaceful in the way that they approach reacting to what they saw.
And Van, we heard activists say this afternoon that they've been trying to warn city leaders for years that there were major issues between police and the Black community. The governor acknowledged what he called decades of pain and anguish. How does a community so angry, so hurting, how would community leaders even begin to try to calm tensions?
Well, it's tough. As you know, I was very close friends with Prince, who was from Minneapolis, from the Twin Cities area, never abandoned that small part of the world, did all of his great work from there. And so I spent a lot of time in Minneapolis. And the situation between that police department and the very small Black community there is atrocious and has been atrocious. There is a long-standing fear in the Black community that there are active white supremacist elements in that department. To give you a sense of how much tension there is, the bus drivers in that town are refusing police orders to move protesters because the bus drivers with ties to the Black community are that mad at the police that they won't even transport. These are the kind of things that I'm hearing from people on the ground. And so it's a deep, deep wound. And I think that the problem is simply this. If you speak up and you're not heard, you might yell. If you yell and you're not heard, then you might scream. If you scream and you're not heard, then you might throw something. And what's happening is you've gotten now an escalation of frustration so that now you're at the point where in order to even be seen as believable in complaining about this department, you have to have an 8-minute videotaped lynching of a man. And so the level of frustration is very, very high. And what I think needs to happen is a couple of things. The mental health, therapy, counseling, we need to get that in large numbers. Moving, the healing part has to happen, but you can't have healing before you have some kind of catharsis. And so people are willing to not only risk arrest, they're risking their lives to protest in a pandemic. They're protesting in the middle of a plague. That's how much pain there is. And so that needs to be given expression, not destroying property, but given expression and respected. And then there needs to be some healing rushed in there. And then for the white community, this is a great opportunity to talk to your children about the history and the present reality of racism. You do not have a society that have this kind of thing happen at this level without it being a very long series of dominoes that have been falling that we have not attended to properly. And so by the time people are yelling and screaming and burning stuff, and we don't even know who's setting these fires, that's the reaction to inaction for too long.
And Laura, we have you as an expert because you're a former prosecutor, but I believe you're also from this area of Minnesota.
I am.
Is this Does this what Van Jones just described, does that ring true in